Thank you and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. Lewis Baldwin from Vanderbilt University, and he's given us some information in reference to the establishment of Jamestown in Virginia in 1619. Of course, Dr. Baldwin, I think that that is a very, very important date in terms of the introduction of Africans into North America. So let's talk about it from that perspective.
Well, we know that in August of 1619, the first 20 Africans landed in Virginia in August 1619. And according to scholars like John Hope Franklin and Lerone Bennett, that was the beginnings, as you said, of the African presence in English North America.
Very good.
Exactly. So 1619 is an important date. It's actually a year before the Puritans landed in America, because as you well know, Lerone Bennett wrote this book before the Mayflower.
That's
and
exactly
he emphasizes the fact that African slaves were here before the Puritans. And we know that among those 20 Africans who landed in Jamestown in 1619 were the names Antony, Isabella, and Pedro. And we know that Isabella and Antony married, and they actually produced the first African born in the English colonies, a boy by the name of William Fuqua, they named him. So you have to go back to 1619, I think, in order to understand what happened subsequently, because you have the foundation of Black history in America. Black history begins there. In 1619 at Jamestown. And of course, we know that you have the development of slavery. By 1661, Virginia had established a kind of statutory recognition of slavery. It became legal, but even before it became legal in 1661, it was in fact slavery in 1619, de facto slavery, before you had the jure slavery. So I think we fail to recognize that if you're going to understand the history of Black people in America, you got to begin with 1619, 400 years ago. And August of this year will represent, as you well know, the 400th anniversary of Black presence in America.
Very good. And that is information that a lot of folks might have known, but I think somewhere along the way we forgot that.
Exactly. A lot of us, we've read scholars like Ivan Van Sertima, who argues that Blacks were here before Columbus. We know that Blacks came over in the 1400s. They were explorers. They accompanied the French and Spanish explorers. Some were with Columbus, the Italian explorer. But when you're going to talk about the establishment of slavery, or the establishment of Black presence in America, 1619
Jamestown is the place.
Jamestown is the place that you got to look at. And 1619, August 1619, to be more specific, is the date.
Talk about that, Dr. Baldwin. I mean, why is that date significant? And give some things in terms of your historical scholarship that will sort of bring all of that information together for people who might not be familiar with some of the things that we're talking about.
I think it's important in so many ways. First of all, if you're going to understand the impact of Black people on the development of America, you got to look at 1619, because that was the moment, I think, at which Black people began to have this powerful and indelible influence on the history of America. So you're not just talking about Black history, you're talking about American history. Also, from that point in 1619, there would always be a question about what does it mean to be American? What is democracy? So I would argue that at that very point, Black people became the critical issue in American history, because when you had the enslavement of these 20 Africans, we have to remember that the Puritans and others who came over, they were in search of freedom. They were moving away from conditions in England and other parts of Europe where they were enslaved and they lacked freedom, so they came to America to experience freedom, to experiment in freedom. But Africans were forcibly brought here from a situation of freedom into a situation of enslavement. So I think you begin to have the question of what is America. How can we profess on the one hand to be a land of freedom while holding certain people in bondage? So I think with 1619, we have the beginnings of these kinds of questions about what does it mean to be America? How can we, on the one hand, reconcile our professions and our values of freedom with the enslavement of certain segments of the American population? So I think, again, that represented a moment. August 1619 represented a moment when blacks began to have this powerful and indelible influence, not only on America, but on what it means to be American, and what is the nature of our democratic values. How do we define our democratic values, our democratic institutions, our democratic traditions?
And it was a long period that Africans were slaves from 1619 to 1865.
Exactly,
Now,
exactly. That's a long
that's
time.
a long period, you see.
That's more than 200 years. But in order to understand the kind of institutionalized slavery that developed, 1619 is the date. You know, because at that point, not only were Africans enslaved, but you had the dehumanization of Africans. And you know, we came along with the Constitution and the 3/5 Compromise and the Dred Scott decision and all of this that occurred. You can't understand these developments apart from what occurred in 1619.
That's right. And how do you count slaves?
Exactly.
You know, are they property? Are they individuals?
Exactly.
And so what we want to do, we'll make a property and individuals.
Exactly.
And we'll just call them 3/5
exactly.
of an individual.
So that speaks, I think, to the uniqueness of the 1619 event, because you not only had the establishment of institutionalized slavery in time, the beginnings of that, but you also had a process that led to the dehumanization of African people, and we are still dealing with the legacy of that today.
Very good. And so what we'll do, Dr. Baldwin, we'll take our first commercial break. I think this is the end of this first segment, and then we'll have an opportunity to talk about some of the events in reference to the enslavement of the African during the second segment. And the third segment, we might be able to talk about what people are doing in order to recognize 1619, because we want to make it a very, very important day. And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break.
Talking the second segment and the third segment, how we are celebrating it.
Okay, very good.
The legacy of 1619.
Okay, legacy of 1619, that'll be an 8-minute
this segment. Yeah,
8-minute segment. Yeah, very good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's going well. It's going well.
This will be the last segment.
Is this the 10-minute segment?
Yes.
Are you sure of that?
Yeah.
Okay, well, you know, we've had some problems with that. At least I've had some problems. They've not had any problems. I think it's the second segment. They said, no, it's the third segment. And then they, well, you know, we had it last time. You know, you sit up here for, you know, 5 shows, 3 segments apiece. That's 15 segments. And you forget whether this is the first, the third, or the final, or whatever, and et cetera. And then, that's good.
Stand by for the third segment.
This is the final segment.
Final segment.
Yeah.
This is the final?
This is the final, last 10 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you and welcome back to the final segment of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. Lewis Baldwin, and he's giving us some information in reference to the establishment of Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. Of course, Dr. Baldwin, I think you've already laid out a very, very good pattern in reference to that. Let's continue that.
Okay, we can talk about the legacy of 1619. You don't hear a lot about that. When you speak of racism, of course, that's part of the legacy in the form of white supremacy, especially. You can talk about racial polarization because That's part of the legacy of 1619. You can talk about established class distinctions, poverty, because I think, you know, poor people came from Europe to America in the 1600s, but you can't talk about the rigid class distinctions and the separation between rich and poor without also looking at 1619.
Jamestown.
Because scholars like Eugene Genovese talks about slavery as an institution based on class, and of course 1619 I think illustrates that as well. We also talk about nativism and xenophobia in this country today.
All right.
We talk about those, but we don't realize that Africans were among the first immigrants, and there were many Americans from Europe who didn't want them here, who felt that they were not born here, they were not a part of the culture, not a part of the establishment of the nation. So nativism and xenophobia, which is of course fear of foreigners, victimized Africans. The first Africans were victimized by that, beginning with Jamestown, of course. And also you have to take into account anti-immigrant sensibilities. We hear a lot about that today. Talk against immigrants, Muslims and immigrants from black and brown countries. But that, you have to go back to 1619 to understand that. Because even at that time, there were Europeans who set foot in this country and established themselves in this country who didn't want Africans here.
Well, where did slavery come from?
Exactly.
Why slavery?
Exactly.
That's exactly what,
exactly. It was not until the early 19th century that Europeans really accepted the fact that slavery could be profitable. In the 1600s, there were questions about it, but the economic profitability of slavery had become evident by the early part of the 19th century, so there was a change in attitude. But in the early years, the 1600s, etc., blacks were among those who came to this country who were not fully accepted. They were not fully accepted after slavery also. But in those early years, there were arguments about whether or not blacks were human, whether or not they had souls. So